Hi everyone, welcome back to This Book Belongs to Pam, and today we're gonna talk about all of the books that I read in March. March was a pretty good reading month for me. I feel like there were a lot of books that I wanted to read. I was in the mood to read all month long. I also had some leftover video projects that bled into this month, so I had a lot to read and that was really fun. I just can't believe that it's the end of March already. Well, technically I'm filming this April 3rd, so we're already in the second quarter of the year, which is kind of surprising and kind of alarming. But in any case, let's look at the stats for the month of March. I read a total of 13 books, and that is 4,436 pages and 1.83 hours. Pretty good. I think this is the highest. Yeah, I think this is the highest month so far, which is always fun to see. Granted, I did read shorter books this month, but that's besides the point. In terms of the vibe and the mood of the books that I was reading, I read mostly emotional, dark, and mysterious books. Those were apparently my vibe for the month of March. And lastly, my average rating for the month is 3.83 stars. Pretty high, pretty high. And I have my first 5-star read, which is exciting. This is my first 5 stars for the entire year. But I also have a 2-star read, so I don't know how I feel about that. But yeah, with that said, let us move on to the books that I actually read for March. The first book that I read is a very much anticipated release for me, and that is A Love Song for Ricki Wilde by Tia Williams. If you didn't know, if you didn't watch my best books of 2023 video, I will link it down below. My favorite, romance for the entire year last year was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. And this just really kind of altered my brain chemistry. It's that, great of a book, and I really loved it, which is why I was so excited for A Love Song for Ricki Wilde. If you're not familiar with this, we are following Ricki Wilde. She is a daughter of a very successful businessman who has this chain of funeral homes. So they're very much rich, upper society, and she wants to build something for herself. So she moves to New York and opens up her own flower shop. During this journey of, creating a name for herself, she meets a very mysterious guy, and essentially this starts this very passionate love story between the both of them, and there are some twists and turns, a little bit of a magical realism, and that is A Love Song for Ricki Wilde. I gave this one 3.75 stars. So this book was actually told in dual timelines. So we get one from the 1920s Harlem. We are following Breeze, who is an up-and-coming musician. He was actually from the South, and he used to work at this plantation, but he has since moved to Harlem in, search of a better life after a tragic family incident. He is also a very talented pianist, a musician, so he is trying to break into that scene in Harlem. And then fast forwarding to the present, we are following Ricki, who, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to build her own coffee shop, make a name for herself. I absolutely adored the 1920s Harlem timeline. I felt like the scenes were very much alive. It was very vivid in my brain. I could see all of the scenes playing out as I was reading them. I didn't quite love this as much as I loved 7 Days in June, and I really don't want to compare, but obviously these are her two works that are very popular, so I can't help but compare. I felt like it was too insta-love for me, especially on Ricki's part, the female protagonist. I don't know, I just didn't feel like there was anything aside from this fate, this cosmic fate that really ties them together. I cannot see why she was so enamored by him at the very, very beginning. Why was she so obsessed at the very, very beginning? And I don't know, I just wish that there was a bit more before they were so head over heels in love for each other. I could kind of understand it from Ezra or the guy's part a little bit because of this cosmic fate again, but with Ricky's part, I just couldn't see why. I wish the love song, because it's a love song for Ricky Wilde, I wish the love song played a much bigger role in the storytelling. I felt like it could have been so much more in terms of how like that love song has been changed, has been affected by this whole magical realism plot. I don't want to spoil too much. It didn't feel like a consistent theme throughout the book when it definitely has the potential to be so. It kind of reminds me of Addie LaRue and how Addie LaRue kind leaves her mark in the music of other people, and I wanted something like that for a love song for Ricky Wilde. The humor also didn't land for me, especially where the couple is concerned. There is this part in the I guess towards the middle where it reads like a montage of them going to like different mystical stores in search of something that I'm not gonna spoil, and it seemed like it was written to be this montage of like really funny, really light-hearted scenes, but it didn't really land for me. It didn't feel like it. I honestly wouldn't be mad if this was longer. I think I would have appreciated getting to know Ezra and Ricky more individually and together. And I want to build something on top of the instant attraction that they had. I wanted something a little bit more than that because it felt like they were attracted to each other and then they were like endgame. And that didn't really sit well with me. But this still has Tia Williams' very good, very beautiful, very emotional writing. And that is something that I have really loved in 7 Days in June. So some of the quotes that I really loved from this book, I'm just gonna blurt out a bunch of random quotes, okay? That's how Dr. Bennett and I loved each other. He was music I could listen to forever. What they heard as frenzied abandonment was the sound of his rage. Their joyous release was his escape, his chance to outrun the memories that stalked him. Jazz was freedom, but grief was his fuel. It was that simple and that terrible. Love well, eat well, fuck well, and leave the world better off than you found it. That's success. Blackness wasn't a concept, an idea for sale. There is no correlation between our value and the white people buying in. There isn't one way to experience a life well lived, and I'm glad I chose my way. See, it has such beautiful writing, and I really wish that the plot and the character development kind of lived up to it. So yeah, I gave this 3.75 stars. Still very good read. Still recommend that you read it. But yeah, it just didn't really live up to, I guess, the expectations that I had for this release. That is A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. The next book that I read is part of the Reading 7 books in 7 different romance subgenres. That's so hard to say. Video that I did, which I will link in the description box. I picked this one for the fantasy romance subgenre, and that is The Curse of Saints by Kate Dramis. So obviously, I already talked about this book in that video, so you can just watch that video for my very real-time thoughts. In this book, we are following Aya, who is a spy master for the queen of this kingdom. She has a skill where she's very good at like persuading people to do her bidding or like to tell her the truth and things like that. She's part of this trio of really high-ranking I guess, officials in this kingdom. So one of them is Will, who is called the Enforcer. He's kind of the guy who tortures people to get information because he is very good at making people feel things. He also, has the ability to feel what other people are feeling. And then there's also their friend, which I'm forgetting the name, who is kind of like the fighter. She has elemental power in fire, and she's like the general of them three. So we're following them as they uncover this plot that seems to be brewing where a set group of like folks are trying to get a hold of raw power and abuse it in order to bring forth kind of like a dark ages for them where power is left unchecked. I'm not sure if this is Kate Thomas's first go at fantasy world building. Sure does feel like it. The way that she's trying to incorporate like the different types of magic, it kind of reminds me of Shadow and Bone with all of the different elemental magic and stuff like that. It kind of has that vibe, but the way that the magic system, the world building has been integrated into the storytelling is a little bit forced. Like, it didn't flow naturally for me. I was constantly taken out of the story to try and sort of parse and understand the world building. It just didn't feel like this movie that I'm watching where I'm like, okay, understanding the situation. I have to like pause, go back to the glossary, check what things are. And I don't know, I just couldn't really get lost in this book. Definitely very comparable to Shadow and Bone. I feel like even though Shadow and Bone's plot is very predictable, very reliant on tropes, I feel like it did a much better job at building the world and introducing it to the different magic systems and the type of people. I did enjoy the plot in this one, even though it dragged on a little bit. There was a lot that they wanted to do in this book, and some of the plot were just like very episodal, where it just happens for like a few pages and then we move on to the next small subplot and then the next small subplot. That's how it felt like to me. Lots of telling and not showing everything that could really show off the skills of the characters. Like, we know that Aya is this amazing spy master, everyone fears her, and then we've got Will, who is this like brutal enforcer. We know that because she told us that, but we don't really see it in action, because for a group of people who are supposed to be really really good at what they do, they kind of get trashed a lot in this book. The writing can be quite confusing during like action scenes. Like, sometimes I get lost in what's happening, and I think I'm pretty good at like understanding action scenes, but in this book I felt like I got lost a lot. I had to reread a lot of like scenes just to understand, okay, that's what's happening. That didn't make sense the first time I read it. It didn't like flow well for me. So unfortunately I had more negatives to say about this book than positives, but I am still gonna be reading the sequel. I think the sequel might fix some of the issues that we've had in this first book, and I am keen to find out what is gonna happen to our characters and to this plot that they have. I gave this one 2.75 stars. I don't really have any quotes for this, but this book had this line, this very infamous line. Aya let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. I can never take that line seriously now, but yeah, it had that line, so that's the writing that you can expect from this book. So that is The Curse of Saints by Kate Tramis. So the next book is actually an audiobook. I listened to The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. There's really not much that I can say about this one, because this is just a very straightforward tell-all of everything that happened to Britney, everything that she went through. Really happy for her that she's able to tell her side of the story. The book is a memoir in the literal sense of the word, so I don't have much really to comment about it. I gave this one 3.5 stars. And then the next book that I read, again, this is also part of that romance video that I did. I read Bride by Ali Hazelwood. In this book, we are following Misery. She is somewhat of a vampire royalty. She is the daughter of the head of all the vampires. And by the way, this is set in the modern world. It's not like gothic vampires. She is tasked to marry the alpha of the werewolves, which is Lo. So they have to get married. It's kind of like this political alliance thing, because they wanted to make sure that the werewolves and the humans don't work together to overthrow essentially vampires. So they're kind of like trying to get the upper hand by presenting this alliance between the vampires and the werewolves. So they get married, and obviously that presents a whole lot of problems, because they're vampires, they're werewolves, they're enemies. Why are they getting married? So that is, I guess, the lay of the land. There's also this mystery, like missing person subplot, and it all comes to a head when we uncover a certain like sinister plot that's happening between the vampires and the werewolves. This is definitely, I think, Ali Hazelwood's best adult romance book, in my opinion. The first half of this book was so strong. It had solid, simple world building. Granted, we are very familiar with vampires and werewolves, so there was a lot of work that needed to be done to like build those, I guess, character tropes. But I feel like the setting of this urban world where you've got vampires, werewolves, humans, and how they all interconnect with each other. I felt like that was done quite well. There wasn't a lot of like super duper exposition heavy parts in the story to establish that. And I also really like that there were a lot of like political concepts in it, concept of the collateral and the interspecies relations, like them having like meetings and summits and functions. I really like that because it kind of solidified the place of vampires, werewolves, and humans in this world. Like, how do they stand? Are vampires and werewolves hidden or not? So it kind of like solidified that. There is really good tension between Misery and Lo, the vampire and the werewolf. There was like so much in the first half of the book that I was really giggling, kicking my feet. I wanted them to just touch every single small interaction between them. I was living for it. That private plane scene, if you know, you know that. Chef's kiss. The build up of the relationship was so good. It didn't feel forced, it didn't feel rushed, and it was mild, but it was true enemies to lovers. However, I think Bride tried to do a little too much. It wasn't long enough to have this slow burn romance. Like, they had really good build up and then everything was super rushed towards the end. It wasn't long enough to be a slow burn romance. It also wasn't long enough to really tackle all of the different plot points, like complicated plot points that they tried to push in this story. So it was kind of like in that awkward middle space where, because of all of the plot points that they wanted to tackle, everything felt super rushed and kind of half-baked. And then the romance, because it was kind of too long for a not slow burn romance, it kind of fizzled out towards the end. And essentially, by the end of it, it felt very half-ass kind of book. But the first half was so strong. It had a lot of potential, which was kind of disappointing that it ended that way. But yeah, I gave this 3.75 stars because I still did enjoy it. That is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. The last book in this wrap up that I read for that romance video was The Stationery Shop by Marian Kamali. This book follows Roya, who is this teenager living in 1953 Tehran, and we are following her as she falls in love with a man who is this very idealistic, very patriotic person. However, in the eve of their supposed wedding, a political upheaval happens, a coup happens, and they got separated, and 60 years later, they kind of found their way to each other once again. And we are just really here to like learn about their story and what the heck happened. Like, how did they get separated? Why didn't they contact each other for 60 years? Definitely has the making of a very heartbreaking novel. This one, for me, has really compelling storytelling. It gave us emotion, it gave us education of culture without it feeling too forced. Our protagonist Roya is in this constant state of melancholy throughout the book, and it kind of feels like her 60-year-old self is telling the story of her life, of her love to her grandchildren, kind of like How I Met Your Father vibes. There are notable parallels between 1953 Tehran, or maybe even present Tehran culture and Filipino culture, so it wasn't really hard for me to grasp like why things happened the way they did, why she had to do things the way that she did. And I feel like that really helped me appreciate this novel more. It kind of like a memoir of her story, like what happened to her, what happened to them, but obviously it's fictional. I really loved it, but the way that it was tied up in the end kind of disappointed me a little. We had this slow and steady build up throughout the book. Like, this much of the book was really good build up to understanding what happened to them, but then the last like very little bit of the book really disappointed me. Letters are a big part of this book, and it has something to do with, you know, how she finds out what happened in the end. And I think the way that it was told towards the end is very lazy. It kind of felt like it was just a flashback and then just listing out, okay, this is what happened, this, and this. These are all of the answers to all of your questions. It didn't feel like it was doing much storytelling rather than just like literally doing a play-by-play of what happened. It didn't have any of the magic of the first, I don't know, 80% of the book in terms of like how the story unfolded. So that was kind of disappointing. There should have been better ways of doing that ending, especially since we know from the first 80% what Marian Kamali's writing reads like, what it feels like, and that was kind of lost towards the end. But there are still some very beautiful writing in this book. I'm just kind of like looking at my tabs here. Very simple lines. It's not like a quote, but kind of like the way things are described. So in this like scene, Roya was looking for a man in the stationery shop. So she was thinking, but the one boy who had burst into the stationery shop and made the world move a little faster, a little more briskly, with a lot more vigor, even if for just a few minutes, was nowhere to be seen. Like, I love that imagery of like when you see that person, it feels like everything is just a lot more alive, a lot more vibrant. So I just really love that imagery. And then there's this other one here. You are in everything I see. In every moment you are with me. And that's so simple, but it's so beautiful, especially in the context of the fact that they are in 1953 Tehran, where, you know, you're not as like public with your affection. Things have to go to a certain like steps. You can't just do things the way that you want them to. So it really like hits hard when they are professing their love to each other. Yeah, I think it was just like really beautiful all throughout, but the ending was just a little bit disappointing. So I gave this 4.25 stars. That is The Stationery Shop by Marian Kamali. The next book that I read is also a very highly anticipated release for me. Also related to the best book that I read last year, like literally the number one best book that I read, which was Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So I read An Education of Malice by S.T. Gibson. This was, I guess, sort of pitched as a Carmilla the First, like, or the original vampire, I guess, retelling, and loosely connected to A Dowry of Blood. So we're still following vampires. It still has that gothic setting. However, I saw a review that described this book as aggressively fine, and honestly, that sums it up so well. Like, aggressively fine. That is the best way I can describe what I felt about this book. I don't know if I just had high expectations because of A Dowry of Blood, but it definitely felt like it was too sanitized, I guess is the term that I would use for this. I did enjoy the setting a lot. I think it did justice to the gothic academia and vampire vibe. It was very atmospheric. I could really picture the school that they were in, the lessons that they were having, all of the different like parties with vampires and stuff like that. I could really picture it. So I think that part S.T. Gibson did really well. I did like the characters individually. Like, I like Laura, I like Carmilla, I like De La Fontaine. Fontaine? But together, like, I couldn't really get behind their relationship dynamic. Like, I felt like it was just told to us that they were like this together, but I didn't really see that in like the things that are happening in the book. I couldn't really get behind how obsessed they were for each other, and I feel like there was a lot of telling in that part rather than showing. There is a plot reveal device thing towards the end that really left a lot to be desired, in my opinion. I really don't think it added anything to the story. I felt like it was kind of just a way to have this exciting climax part of the plot, but honestly, I don't think it needed that. I felt like if we had just done a deep dive into this unhealthy, toxic, codependent relationship that they had all together, I felt like that would have been so good. But maybe because obviously that's a theme in A Dowry of Blood, so maybe she was trying to like move away from that and do a more traditional like beginning, middle, end kind of plot, which I understand, but I just don't think it was done quite well. It feels like it was just like added in there towards the end. It didn't feel like it was integral to the story, to the whole book. It still had S.T. Gibson's, you know, signature like writing, where it's very lyrical, like vivid. It has very vivid imagery. This was a specific quote that I really loved. She kissed me with a martyr's agonized desperation, like I was the only sword she ever wanted to fall on. I kissed her right back like the cutting edge of a blade, trying to inflict as much damage as possible. I really like that. There's like a lot of like imagery, and I feel like if she focused on that dynamic where they kind of hate each other but they're obsessed and attracted to each other and then they don't understand why. I think Gibson just honed in on that. This would have been a much more compelling book. So yeah, I gave this 3.25 stars. The next three books that I read are actually graphic novels. So I read Heartstopper 1, 2, and 3 by Alice Oseman. And honestly, why did it take me so long to pick this one up? I would never understand. It was so good, so lighthearted, so cozy, and honestly, the art style screams like coming of age, and that really added to the reading experience for me. I gave this one 4.5 for volume 1, 5 stars for volume 2, and 4 stars for volume 3. I don't really have much to say in each individual volume, but the reason why I gave 5 stars to volume 2 was because I really liked how Nick's character development was handled. So he was overcome with this confusion because, there's this realization of potentially being queer, and he was really confused about it, but I really like how it was handled. It wasn't overly romanticized where, this is like a beautiful journey of finding out who you truly are and blah, blah, blah. Because obviously it could be that, but it's also realistic to think that it's a very confusing and turbulent time for someone, especially in current climate where it's not, obviously it has improved, but it's still not as, accepted as it should be. So there is this concept of it being a very difficult time for a person who is trying to figure out their identity, but it also wasn't like villainized. Like it wasn't very like trauma dumping vibes, even though obviously that can also be true, but it wasn't that. Kind of kept it very personal to Nick, very reflective from his point of view, rather than something that's trying to generalize an entire world. Because I feel like a lot of books that talk about coming out and queers, obviously there's space for that as well, but since this is more of like a light-hearted coming of age story, it felt very appropriate for it to be more of a personal journey, and I really like that. So I gave this one 5 stars. But yeah, I'm so excited to continue the rest of the graphic novels. I'm definitely gonna be reading them this April, so you can watch out for my thoughts on that in April's wrap up. The next book that I read is for Jan Agaton's Full Moon Book Club, which is Bonesmith by Nikki Pao Preto. This is a YA fantasy novel. We're following Ren, who is a bonesmith. So she is basically a person who can control dead bones, aka bones are not connected to the soul of a person. The book starts with Ren getting ready to take part in this examination that everyone who is, who wants to be a proper bonesmith goes through. They have to go through a bonewood forest and do certain tasks, and she was tricked. Something happened, she was tricked, and she loses out on becoming a bonesmith, and she was sent into the wall, essentially. Think about it as like Game of Thrones wall because it really separates the kingdom from this unchecked undead territory where like something happened years and years ago that caused that area to be very dangerous and to have a lot of like undead. Honestly, this is one of the most well-rounded YA fantasy that I've read in a while. First of all, I really like Ren. She is a very strong female protagonist, but she doesn't like succumb to the strong female protagonist stereotypes. I felt like she had a very good development and she was a full-fledged character by the end of the book. We also have an interesting cast of characters. They all have very distinct personalities, and it has this found family vibe, which I always love in my fantasy books. The world building itself was immersive enough, and it was easy to imagine. I also like that it didn't rely too heavily on exposition to introduce the world. It was like woven within the narrative, within the dialogues, within all of the different scenes playing, rather than just like dumping all of the information at the beginning. I mean, obviously there are moments where it kind of was doing that, but it wasn't like the bulk of the book, which I really appreciated. Plot-wise, it was definitely predictable, but that didn't really take away from my enjoyment of reading the book. I pretty much like predicted most of like the big plot reveals very early on, but I still was engaged enough, intrigued enough to still read the entire book. So I feel like maybe because it's YA and maybe because I have read quite a bit of fantasy, maybe that's why it's predictable to me, but it was still enjoyable, which is, the more important thing. I don't really have a lot of like true negative things to say about this book other than like a couple of like nitpicky things. One, I felt like it lacked the winter vibe, like the winter imagery. I keep forgetting that this was mostly set during the winter. Like I forget every single time until they say that there's like snow in there or like they're shivering or they're whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, this is winter. I don't know why. I feel like the writing just didn't allude to the winter vibes too much where I felt like it was actually winter. And then I guess the next small thing is that the action scenes, I think it needs to be a little bit more exciting. The author does this thing where while an action scene is playing out, she's gonna insert a little bit of like world building where she's like, I can't think of a specific scene, but for example, let's say Ren is gonna like hit the armor of this guy and she like notices something about the armor. The
armor is made of this, and this was built by this kind of smith, and that means that it has this kind of properties, and over the past years we thought that this was no longer existing.
Like she goes into this like tangent in her brain about this armor, and I'm just thinking, girl, you're mid fighting scene, you're mid like stabbing this guy, and you're thinking all of this historical stuff. I don't think so. I don't think that's the time and place to do that. And that kind of like dragged down the action scenes. It made them feel so slow and a lot less exciting when it could have been really snappy, really explosive feeling. Sometimes it kind of got like bogged down by world building. But that is like small things. It didn't really happen all too much, but that was just something that I did notice. Overall, I really liked it. I really enjoyed reading it. Definitely gonna be reading the sequel. Here is a quote that I really liked from it. It's from the very, very like beginning when they were like describing the Bonewood forest, and it really set the tone for me. It really helped me visualize everything. So the quote says, "This was no ordinary forest after all. This was the Bonewood. Arms and legs soared up from the ground, twisted and warped, bent and broken, dead, soulless bones, undead, haunted bones, human bones, yes, but other creatures too." Like I love the imagery of like bones of like different species just sticking out from the floor, and those are like your trees, those are like your forest. I gave this one 4 stars. That was Bonesmith by Nikki Pao Preto. The next book that I read is part of a future video project, so I don't really want to talk too much about it. But I read Hooked by Emily McIntyre. This is a dark romance book inspired by Peter Pan. The author is adamant that this is not a retelling. It's just, I guess, inspired by the characters and the events in Peter Pan. I was really intrigued by this book because of the concept, but I thought it was really not well written. I don't know. So in this book we are following Hook and Wendy. Hook is like one of the top guys in this drug mafia gang thing. And then Wendy is the daughter of a very successful businessman who owns airlines. His dad's name is Peter Michaels. Hook is enamored by Wendy when Wendy walks into one of his bars. So they start this very intense relationship. So that is the premise. There's like a lot of like plot things about like revenge, about a dark past and things like that. Like if I say more, it's gonna spoil the entire thing. I did not really like this that much, like in any way, shape, or form. The characters are very like bland and two-dimensional. The plot itself was very basic, and the thing that I really hated the most is how every single conflict, every single problem, every single issue that they as like couple, as this relationship, and as individuals had in this book was resolved pretty much like after, I don't know, 10 pages. Like, they would have a problem on page 7, and then by page 17, it would be resolved. Like, everything was so simple. Everything was just, there was no struggle. The characters in this book did not have to make a lot of effort in order to resolve any of the issues that they have. But yeah, I don't really want to say too much, but I just didn't really like it that much, and I gave this 2 stars. The next book that I read is for Jamie's Library's book club, and we read Rouge by Mona Awad. This is also a highly anticipated book by me because I read Bunny and All's Well by Mona Awad, and I really enjoyed both of those books, like really enjoyed those, so I had really high hopes for this one. In Rouge, we are following Belle, who is obsessed with beauty, with skincare. She is the type of person to have, I don't know, a 50-step skincare routine. And yeah, she just really is obsessed about maintaining beauty, gaining beauty, and things like that. Her mother dies unexpectedly, and she goes to California to bury her mother and to settle her affairs. And that's when she finds out that her mom is kind of like part of this members only spa that feels like a cult. So she's intrigued. She's thinking, oh, is this why my mom is so beautiful? Because her mom is described as this flawless beauty. And she kind of envies her mom's beauty. She kind of hates her for it a little bit. So she's like curious, is this why my mom is this beautiful? Because I want to know her secret. So I am going to go to this sketchy cultish spa and figure out what she's doing to be that beautiful. So she goes in there, and as you might have expected, things aren't what it seems. So she discovers what the secret is and goes into this spiral. And yeah, that is essentially the premise. This book, I went back and forth so much about how I felt about this book. I initially rated it, I think, 3.5 stars, and then I thought, no, it's actually 4.25 after I thought about it, and then I dialed it back to 3.75. I just really did not know what I thought about this book. I could not make up my mind if I really enjoyed it or not, but I settled for 4 stars because I thought that it was very intriguing. I felt like it was good. It reads like a good book, like it had really compelling conversations on beauty standards, on race, how women are always expected more than men to follow a certain beauty standard, and the lengths that women go to in order to achieve that, and the imagery and all of the crazy things that happen, all of the unhinged things that happen here really support that narrative. But at the same time, I couldn't really give it more than 4 stars because I was not as immersed in this book as I thought I would be. Like with Bunny and All's Well, I was all in. It was so unhinged. It was crazy. Half the time it's hard to understand what's going on, that you have to kind of like stop and think about it. But I was still immersed. I was in it. But with this one, it was so easy for me to get distracted. It was so easy for me to just put the book down and not pick it back up. It's a good thing that I read this during sprints, so I was kind of forced to like really sit down and just read it. But if I wasn't, I felt like it would have taken me so long to finish it. I don't know. I feel like there was something in the writing style that really did not connect with me, which is, you know, I love the Bunny. I love All's Well, but this one just felt like it was kind of clunky and it really dragged in some parts. I feel like this had some pacing issues in it. So yeah, that's why I couldn't really give it more than 4 stars, but I do like the themes. I do like the conversations, and I feel like this is a really good book for discussion, which is something that I guess is true with all of Mona Awad's work. But I do think I need to like reread this and kind of like really sit down and think about it. Now that I know what's gonna happen, I can like be more in tune with like the subtext, with the imagery, and with the comparisons that are happening throughout the book rather than like the plot of it. Because there is a plot, but it was kind of really muddled by all of the other things. So I feel like I maybe would have appreciated this more if there wasn't like that plot, like if it didn't really focus on that, but just focus on the narrative of beauty standards and the lengths that people go to, you know, achieve those beauty standards. So yeah, I don't know. Even as I'm speaking of it now, like I'm still not even convinced that I want to give this 4 stars. Like I'm thinking like maybe 3.75. Like I'm still not convinced. I'm just looking at my tabs now to see if there's like some quotes that I wanna say. Yeah. This one really I had a hard time. Like I really did not know how I feel about this book, and that is Rouge by Mona Awad. Final book that I read in March, which I technically finished in the 1st of April. Like I finished it in the very early morning of April, like I don't know, 3 a.m. or something like that. So I'm counting it for March because I read like 90% of it in March, and that is Even If This Love Disappears Tonight by Misaki Ichijo. So thank you again to Ashlyn because she gifted me this book. This is also part of my 12 Rex 12 Friends challenge. I read this book on a whim. I just wanted something different. This is a literary romance, and we are following 2 high school students, who starts fake dating. And however, we find out that the girl Hino actually has anterograde amnesia, where she cannot remember the events that happened the day before. So it's kind of like 51st date. We kind of see them, work through this unfortunate circumstance and kind of see how their love can still blossom throughout it all. And this book to me is a book about the beauty of young love. Paradoxically, this book has such an uncomplicated love story, even though they were facing very unusual, very unfortunate circumstances. But I don't know, it was just really beautiful and certainly heartbreaking in the way that most Japanese literature are. Because yes, this is translated from Japanese. I don't want to say too much because this is such a short book, but if you're familiar with Japanese like sad stories, they are very sad and very tragic, and this is not an exception. This is kind of like a slice of life kind of book, so there's not really much I can say in terms of like the plot, but it's really just a look at how people fall in love and the beauty of the small things that you do for your loved ones and how that compounds over time even though we don't really notice it that much. But yeah, this is so beautiful, and it definitely made me cry a little bit. Tears were shed when I was reading this book. I'm just looking at some of the writing here because it has beautiful writing, but not because the words are beautiful, but it's just like the sentiment was beautiful. I don't know if it's a issue with the translation. Maybe if it was, in Japanese, it would have been a lot more lyrical, a lot more beautiful in terms of like the writing. But the sentiment behind the words were really beautiful. There's this part where the guy Toru was looking at Hino as he was like starting to fall in love with her. He was thinking, I was glad that we had built something together, even if it was small. I closed my eyes. The sensation spread a little. I savored it. The warmth of the sun, the smell of the grass, even the breathing of the person next to me. A strong wind blew, and I opened my eyes. Hino was holding back her long hair. In that moment, I wanted to tell her. So it was just really beautiful imagery of, how when you're just looking at someone and then you just notice all of these small things that are happening around them because you're really like savoring this view that you have of that person, similar to like the stationery shop earlier where things just felt a little bit more vivid, like time felt a little bit more urgent. It kind of has that same vibe. There's also this ongoing, I guess, conversation here about what memories are worth if you can't really accumulate them, if you can't retain them and build on top of them. Like, why would you make memories for today if it's gonna be gone again tomorrow? What is the point of that? Very heartbreaking. I just really loved it. I gave this one 4.5 stars. There's also a movie adaptation for it. I'm not ready to watch it yet. I feel like I'm gonna sob and bawl, so I don't want to watch it yet. But yeah, if you really want a short book that will tear your heart into pieces, I recommend Even If This Love Disappears Tonight by Misaki Ichijo. And that is it. Those are all of the books that I read for the month of March. Somebody's coming to say hi. I felt like it was quite a good reading month for me. A variety of different books that I've read, which makes me happy. I hope you also had a good reading month. I will see you again in the next video. Bye!